It was a Thursday morning. The churches were preparing for Mass, the market was opening. The fishermen were already at the water. Children were walking to school through streets they had walked 1,000 times before dot, and then, at 8 minutes past 8, 30,000 people vanished from the face of the earth. Not slowly. Not with warning. Not with time enough to run or pray or say goodbye dot in less time than it takes to boil water for tea. An entire city, a city with theaters and trams and telegraph lines, a city the French called the Little Paris of the Caribbean, was erased dot by something that had no name in science, yet dot by something that moved faster than fear itself, the mountain behind. Saint-Pierre had been rumbling for weeks. The animals had fled. The rivers had turned gray. The ground had trembled at night beneath people's beds. Every sign was there dot, and yet the city stayed. Because the men in power told them to. Because an election was 6 days away. Because human beings, even standing in the shadow of a waking volcano, have an extraordinary capacity to believe that tomorrow will resemble today, though it did not. This is the story of Mont Pelée, of the city it swallowed in 8 minutes, of the 30,000 lives lost on a May morning in 1902, and of what their deaths taught a world that was not yet ready to listen to the earth. We are going to take you there to the last days of Saint-Pierre to the morning the mountain spoke. And no one was left to answer that there are places in the world that seem born from a dream. Martinique was one of them at the dawn of the 20th century. Those who arrived by ship to the port of Saint-Pierre were met with a sight that stole the breath. White houses scattered along the coast. Gardens of banana trees and sugar canes swaying in the breeze. The scent of spices carried across the warm Caribbean air. The French called it Le Petit Paris des Antilles. The little Paris of the Antilles and it was no exaggeration. Saint-Pierre was the cultural and commercial heart of the island. It had a grand opera house, elegant cafes, a stone cathedral, and trams that rolled across cobblestone streets. 30,000 people called it home. Others arrived every week on ships crossing the Atlantic. Merchants, artists, officials, dreamers. It was a city that believed in itself. But there was something the postcards never showed. Rising behind the city, draped in cloud and jungle, stood Mont Pelée. In French, the name means the bald mountain, a quiet giant. A presence so familiar that most residents had long stopped looking up. The mountain had been part of their lives for generations. It was simply there, and like all things we take for granted, no one asked what it was truly capable of. The island of Martinique sits in the eastern Caribbean, part of a volcanic arc known as the Lesser Antilles, a chain of islands born from the collision of tectonic plates, deep beneath the ocean floor. Beneath the beauty, the geology was always restless. But in 1902, that restlessness had a name, and it was about to speak. It began quietly. As it almost always does. In early 1902, the people of Saint-Pierre noticed things. Small things. The kind of things that, taken alone, might seem like nothing at all. A faint smell of sulfur drifting down the slopes. A thin veil of ash settling on windowsills in the morning. The birds, some said, had grown restless. The animals in the fields seemed uneasy, but a city of 30,000 has its rhythms, markets to open, ships to unload, children to send to school. Life has a way of filling every moment, leaving little room for the warnings that come without words. Mont Pelée had rumbled before. In 1792, and again in 1851. The mountain had shown signs of life, steam, small tremors, a brief reminder that it was not simply a hill covered in jungle. Both times the activity had passed. Both times the mountain had returned to its long silence. And so, over the decades, a kind of quiet confidence had settled over the island. It grumbles sometimes. It always calms down. That belief, so human and so understandable, would prove to be the most dangerous thing on the island. By February of 1902. The fumaroles near the summit, those small vents where steam and gas escape from the earth, had grown more active. The smell of sulfur became harder to ignore. Ash began to fall more regularly on the northern villages closest to the mountain. Still, the city continued. In March, something shifted. The Rivière Blanche, the White River, which descended from the slopes of Pelée toward the sea, began to carry unusual amounts of ash and sediment. The water turned gray. The river, which had always been a source of life for those who lived along its banks, was changing its character. And then came the sounds, deep, low rumbles. Not the sharp crack of an earthquake, but something slower, more resonant, as if the earth itself were clearing its throat. Residents in the northern parishes reported hearing these sounds at night, lying in their beds, wondering if what they felt was real or imagined it was real. On April 23rd, a series of explosions shook the summit. Columns of steam and ash rose into the sky. The sight was dramatic enough to draw crowds to the waterfront of Saint-Pierre, where people gathered to watch, some with fascination, some with unease. A local newspaper, Les Colonies, reported on the activity. Scientists were consulted. Reassurances were offered. Governor Louis Moutet, a man acutely aware that legislative elections were scheduled for May 11th, was concerned not about the volcano, but about the panic that might cause voters to flee the island. The political calendar, it seemed, had become entangled with the geological one. A scientific commission was assembled and sent to assess the situation. Their report, delivered in early May, concluded that Saint-Pierre was in no immediate danger. The governor and his wife, in a gesture meant to inspire confidence, announced they would remain in the city. On April 25th. The crater lake at the summit, a body of water that had long sat peacefully between the peaks, began to boil. On April 27th, a lahar, a fast-moving torrent of volcanic mud and debris, swept down the Rivière Blanche. It destroyed a rum distillery at the river's mouth and killed approximately 23 workers caught in its path. The sea at the mouth of the river turned dark with ash and sediment. These were no longer small things, and yet the official message remained the same: stay calm. Stay in the city. There is no cause for alarm. On the slopes above Saint-Pierre, the jungle that had always been so lush, so green, so alive, was turning gray. Trees coated in ash. The air heavy with the smell of sulfur. Thousands of snakes, freelance vipers, disturbed from their habitat by the volcanic gases and the trembling of the earth, began descending the mountain toward the villages below. In the village of Le Pracheur, the snakes arrived in waves. Hundreds of animals, then thousands. They moved through the streets, into homes, into fields. 50 people were killed. Over 200 animals, horses, mules. Cattle died from the bites. It was a sign unlike any other. Nature was fleeing the mountain. And still, the city of Saint-Pierre prepared for its elections. The mountain had been speaking for months now, in ash, in mud, in smell, in sound, in the flight of every creature that could find its way to lower ground. The tragedy of what was to come was not only geological. It was human. It was the story of how we hear what we wish to hear and ignore the rest. The mountain had spoken. The city had chosen not to listen. To understand what was about to happen. We must go deeper. Much deeper. Far beneath the turquoise waters of the Caribbean. Far beneath the coral and the sand and the dark pressures of the ocean floor. Two of the Earth's great tectonic plates have been locked in a slow, silent struggle for millions of years. The North American plate, vast and ancient, moves westward. And as it moves, it encounters the Caribbean plate, and it does not stop. It dives beneath it, slowly, relentlessly, at a rate of only a few centimeters per year. A movement so gradual that no human being could ever feel it in a single lifetime. But the Earth feels it. This process, called subduction, is one of the most powerful forces our planet possesses. As the North American plate descends into the heat of the mantle, it carries with it something crucial: water. Water locked inside the minerals of the oceanic crust. And as the plate sinks deeper, as the pressure and temperature increase beyond imagination, that water is released. And water changes everything. When water enters the hot mantle rock above the descending plate, it lowers the melting point of that rock. Stone that would otherwise remain solid begins to melt. It becomes magma, molten rock, superheated, under enormous pressure, searching for a way out. It rises, slowly at first, then with greater urgency, finding pathways through the crust, collecting in vast underground chambers, building pressure over years, over decades, over centuries. This is how the Lesser Antilles were born. This entire arc of islands, from Grenada in the south to Saba in the north, is the surface expression of that subduction zone. Each island is, in essence, the tip of a volcano rising from the ocean floor. Some are dormant, some are extinct, and some, like Mont Pelée, are very much alive. Mont Pelée rises to roughly 1,397 meters above sea level. But that number tells only part of the story. The mountain's roots extend far below the surface of the island, connecting to a magmatic system of extraordinary complexity. Over thousands of years, Pelée had erupted many times, leaving behind layers of volcanic rock, ash deposits, and ancient lava flows that geologists would one day study with great care. But in 1902, the science of volcanology was still young. The word itself, volcanology, had barely entered common use. The instruments available to scientists were limited. The understanding of what drove volcanic eruptions, of what made one eruption gentle and another catastrophic, was still being assembled piece by piece. What scientists did not yet fully understand was the critical role of magma. Composition. Not all magma is the same. The magma beneath Mont Pelée was of a type called andesitic, named after the Andes Mountains, where this kind of rock is common. Andesitic magma is thick, viscous. It does not flow easily, the way the more fluid basaltic lava of Hawaii does. Instead, it resists movement. It traps gases inside itself: water vapor, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, building pressure with nowhere to go. Think of it this way. Imagine shaking a bottle of sparkling water. The gas inside builds pressure. If you open the cap slowly, the gas escapes gently. But if the cap is stuck, if it cannot release, the pressure builds and builds until something gives way. Mont Pelée's magma was that stuck cap, and beneath the mountain, in the weeks leading up to May 1902, the pressure had been building to a point that the mountain could no longer contain. There was another element that made Pelée uniquely dangerous, and that scientists would only come to fully appreciate after the catastrophe. The shape of the volcano itself. Mont Pelée was not a wide, open-vented mountain. Its summit was partially blocked. The magma rising through the conduit was meeting resistance at the top. Rather than venting gradually, pressure was accumulating laterally, sideways, inside the upper flanks of the mountain. This meant that when the mountain finally broke, it would not simply erupt upward. It would explode outward and directed straight toward Saint-Pierre. There is a particular cruelty in geological coincidence. The city had not been built in the wrong place by ignorance alone. For generations, the mountain had been quiet. The land was fertile. The harbor was perfect. Every practical reason pointed toward Saint-Pierre as the ideal location. No one could have known, with the science available at the time, that the mountain's geometry, its internal structure, its magma composition, and its blocked summit would one day conspire to aim the full force of its fury at the most populated place on the island. The earth does not choose its victims, but sometimes the angles are merciless. By the first days of May 1902, the mountain was no longer simply venting steam and ash. It was entering a new phase, more explosive, more violent, more urgent. The ground trembled with increasing frequency. A thick column of ash and gas rose from the summit and darkened the sky above Saint-Pierre. The sea and the harbor had grown warm to the touch, and somewhere deep beneath the mountain, something enormous was moving upward. It had been moving for a very long time. Now at last, it was almost at the surface. And they arrived the way it always did in Martinique. Warm, humid, the sky a deep, unwavering blue above the harbor. The bougainvillea still flowering along the garden walls. The market stall still open. The fishermen still mending their nets along the waterfront. But something had changed in the air. Not just the smell of sulfur, which by now had become a constant companion to daily life. Something quieter than that. Something harder to name. A tension that settled over the city like a second sky, invisible, but felt by everyone who stopped long enough to notice it. The ash was falling every day. Now it coated the rooftops. The leaves, the shoulders of men and women walking to work. Children drew patterns in it on window ledges. Shopkeepers swept it from their doorsteps each morning, only to sweep again by afternoon. Life continued. Because life always finds a way to continue, but it continued. Under a gray veil that grew a little thicker with each passing day. The northern roads out of Saint-Pierre were crowded. Families from the villages closest to the mountain had begun to move. They came into the city carrying what they could. Bundles of clothing, children on their backs, animals on ropes. They had watched the snakes descend. They had smelled the gases growing stronger. They had felt the tremors in their floors at night. They were leaving, but the city itself remained full. In fact, it was fuller than usual. Because the refugees from the north had swelled the population of Saint-Pierre. And because the government, still determined to project calm ahead of the May 11th elections, had actively discouraged evacuation. The official voice of authority, the newspapers, the governor's office, the scientific commission continued to speak in measured, reassuring tones. The situation is being monitored. There is no cause for alarm. Saint-Pierre is safe. Those words would echo long after the city fell silent. On May 5th, something happened that should have ended all debate. The crater lake on the summit, already boiling for days, finally overflowed. A massive lahar, far larger than the one that had struck in late April, roared down the Rivière Blanche with terrifying speed. It was not water. It was a wall of superheated mud, volcanic debris, and rock. Moving faster than a man could run. It struck the Garin sugar factory at the base of the river with total devastation. The factory was destroyed in moments. The workers inside had no time to flee. The lahar continued to the sea, generating a small but violent tsunami that swept along the coast of Saint-Pierre, flooding the lower streets, overturning boats in the harbor, sending waves crashing through the waterfront. 30 people died that day. The sea itself seemed to recoil from what was coming. And still, the official position did not change. Governor Mount visited the city on May 7th. He walked the streets. He spoke to residents. He and his wife dined in public, a deliberate act of calm meant to signal that the danger was overstated, that the people of Saint-Pierre had nothing to fear. It was an act of extraordinary courage, or extraordinary blindness. History has debated which ever since. On the evening of May 7th, the mountain produced its largest explosion yet. A column of ash and gas rose miles into the sky. Lightning crackled inside the eruption cloud, a phenomenon caused by the violent collision of ash particles generating static electricity. The sound carried across the island and out to sea, heard by sailors miles from shore. In Saint-Pierre, people stood on their balconies and watched. Some prayed. Some wept. Some simply stood in silence, unable to look away. Among them was a young assistant at the telegraph office, who sent a message to Martinique's administrative capital, Fort-de-France, that evening. The message described the scene above the city. It ended with words that have never been forgotten. Have a good night. If we are still alive tomorrow, we will send more news. They would not send more news. That night, in the harbor of Saint-Pierre, ships rocked uneasily at anchor. Several captains considered sailing. Some did. The captain of a ship called the Gabriel decided the weather was unfavorable for departure and stayed. He would not survive the morning. In the city, most people went to bed. What else could they do? They had been told they were safe. They had lives to return to, jobs, families, routines built over years. The human instinct, when surrounded by the familiar, is to believe that the familiar will hold, that the streets you have walked 1,000 times will still be there tomorrow, that the mountain behind the city is still, in the end, just a mountain. The night of May 7th passed slowly. The sky above Saint-Pierre glowed faintly orange at the summit. The smell of sulfur was heavy in the air. The harbor was warm. The earth trembled softly, almost gently, like something breathing in a restless sleep. 30,000 people lay in their homes. They did not know that this was the last night their city would exist. They did not know that in a matter of hours, everything, the cathedral, the theater, the cafes, the cobblestone streets, the ships in the harbor, the gardens, the memories, the voices would be gone, erased in minutes. By something that had no name yet in the vocabulary of science. Something the world would only come to understand after Saint-Pierre was no longer there to tell the story. May 8, 1902. Thursday. The feast day of the Ascension. one of the most sacred dates in the Catholic calendar. Churches across Martinique would have been preparing for morning mass, candles lit, bells ready to ring. In Saint-Pierre, the morning arrived as mornings do, gradually, softly, with the light coming first over the sea to the east, painting the harbor gold before touching the slopes of the mountain. To the north. It was 7:52 in the morning. The clocks in Saint-Pierre were still running for 8 more minutes. What happened at 8 minutes? Past 8 on the morning of May 8, 1902, would be recorded in the history of volcanology as one of the most violent and consequential eruptions in recorded history. But in Saint-Pierre, there was no time for records, no time for understanding, no time for anything at all. The mountain did not erupt upward. It exploded outward from the southern flank of Mont Pelée, with a force that geologists would later estimate as equivalent to several nuclear detonations. The volcano released what science would eventually name a nuée, ardente, a French term meaning glowing cloud. But cloud is too gentle a word. What descended on Saint-Pierre that morning was a pyroclastic density current, a phenomenon so extreme, so unlike anything the science of the time could fully explain, that it would take decades of study before volcanologists truly understood what had killed an entire city in minutes. It was not lava. It did not flow like a river. It was a superheated avalanche of gas, ash, and volcanic rock moving at speeds estimated between 100 and 600 kilometers per hour. Its temperature at the point of origin exceeded 800 degrees Celsius. Some estimates place it closer to 1,000. It moved faster than sound could warn of its arrival. It moved faster than any human being could run. It moved faster than fear itself. The wave struck Saint-Pierre from the north and northwest simultaneously, 2 lobes of the current, splitting around the mountain's geometry and converging on the city from multiple directions. There was no shelter, no building strong enough, no street wide enough to offer escape. What the pyroclastic current carried was not simply heat. It carried pressure. A blast wave of superheated gas that arrived ahead of the main current, invisible, instantaneous, shattering windows, collapsing walls, overturning the ships in the harbor before the burning cloud itself even arrived. The ships, 18 vessels, were anchored in the harbor of Saint-Pierre that morning. Within minutes of the eruption, all but one were sunk or capsized. The Gabrielle, whose captain had chosen not to sail the night before, was thrown onto its side and destroyed. The Roraima, a Canadian steamship that had arrived just the day before, was set ablaze. Her captain and most of her crew were killed. A handful of survivors, horribly burned, would later describe what they saw from the water, descriptions that remain among the most extraordinary eyewitness accounts in the history of natural disasters. One survivor aboard the Roraima, a young nurse named Claire King, described a wall of fire coming down the mountain and across the water. She survived, badly burned, sheltering below deck. She would spend months recovering. On land, survival was almost impossible. In the southern corner of Saint-Pierre, below street level, was a small military dungeon. A single underground cell. Thick stone walls. A narrow, barred window facing away from the mountain. Inside it, on the morning of May 8th, sat a prisoner. His name was Louis Auguste Cyprus. He had been jailed for a minor offense just days before the eruption. He would later describe hearing a tremendous noise, feeling intense heat, and then darkness. Superheated gas and ash entered through the small window and burned him severely on his back and legs, but the stone walls held. He survived. For 4 days. He remained in the cell, injured, dehydrated, calling for help, until rescuers, picking through the ruins of the city, finally heard his voice. Louis Auguste Cyprus became one of the most famous survivors in volcanic history. He later joined the Barnum and Bailey Circus, where he was billed as the only living object that survived in the silent city of Saint-Pierre. He carried his scars for the rest of his life. There were perhaps 2 or 3 other survivors in the city that day. The accounts vary. The numbers are uncertain. But in a city of 30,000 people, the margin between life and death on the morning of May 8th was measured not in decisions or in strength or in speed. It was measured in stone, in depth, In the accident of where one happened to be standing when the mountain chose to speak, the pyroclastic current passed over Saint-Pierre in minutes. When it was done, the city no longer existed. The buildings had not burned slowly, as in an ordinary fire. They had been blasted, shattered, and incinerated almost simultaneously. The cathedral walls still stood in places, massive stone structures, resistant enough to survive the initial blast, but everything inside them was gone. The theater was rubble. The trams lay overturned in the streets. The cobblestones were buried under meters of ash and volcanic debris. The garden walls, along which the bougainvillea had bloomed just the day before, were bare and gray. The harbor, which had been the pride of Saint-Pierre, busy, beautiful, full of the commerce of the Caribbean, was a graveyard of sunken ships. And over everything, a silence, the kind of silence that only exists where sound has been completely erased. 30,000 lives. 8 minutes past 8, a Thursday. Morning in May. The feast of the Ascension, the mountain had spoken at last. And the world would never look at a volcano the same way again. The news traveled slowly at first. As news did. In 1902. It moved by telegraph, by ship, by word of mouth carried across water. But when it arrived, when the world finally understood what had happened on a small island in the Caribbean on the morning of May 8th, the silence that followed was unlike anything the modern age had yet experienced. An entire city. Gone. Damaged, not partially destroyed, not evacuated in time. Gone. The first ships to approach Saint-Pierre in the hours after the eruption found a coastline they could not recognize. The landmarks were missing. The church towers, the rooftops, the harbor lights. Everything that had made Saint-Pierre identifiable from the sea had been erased or buried under a thick, still smoking layer of ash and debris. The rescuers who went ashore, soldiers, sailors, volunteers from Fort de France, described a landscape from another world. The streets were unrecognizable. The buildings that still stood were shells, their interiors completely destroyed. The heat, even hours later, was intense enough to make progress difficult. Fires still burned in the ruins. The air was thick with ash and the smell of sulfur. And beneath it all, the silence, that terrible absolute silence. No voices calling for help. No movement in the streets. No animals. No birds, just the soft creak of cooling stone and the distant sound of the sea. The rescuers moved through the ruins in a state of collective disbelief. They were trained for emergencies. They were accustomed to hardship. But nothing in their experience had prepared them for the scale of what they were walking through. This was not a disaster site. This was an extinction. The bodies they found. And they found many told the story of a death so fast that most victims had no time to react. People were found in the positions of their last moments. Seated at tables. Standing in doorways. Caught mid-step in the street. The pyroclastic current had been so swift, so total, that the city had been frozen in time, a dark mirror of Pompeii, which had lain buried beneath Italian soil for nearly 18 centuries. The comparison was not lost on the journalists and scientists who arrived in the days that followed. From Europe, from North America, from across the Caribbean. They came with notebooks and cameras in the urgent need to understand what had happened here. Among the scientists was Angelo Heilprin, an American geologist who had become one of the first to study the ruins systematically. He arrived within weeks of the eruption and spent months documenting what he found, the patterns of destruction, the direction of the blast, the behavior of the pyroclastic current as it moved through the city's streets. His work, and the work of others who followed, would begin to rewrite the science of volcanology, because what had happened at Saint-Pierre did not fit neatly into existing understanding. Volcanoes, in the scientific thinking of the time, erupted upward. Lava flowed downhill. Ash fell from the sky. These were the known dangers, the predictable ones. But the nuée ardente, the glowing cloud, was something else entirely. It moved laterally. It traveled at extraordinary speed. It killed not primarily through lava or falling rock, but through heat and pressure, and toxic gas, a combination so lethal that survival within its path was virtually impossible. Regardless of what a person did or where they tried to hide. This was new. This was something science had to name, to study, to understand, so that it might one day be anticipated. The photographs taken in the weeks after the eruption circulated around the world in newspapers and illustrated magazines. They showed a city of ruins under a gray sky, broken walls, buried streets, the skeletal remains of ships in the harbor, a cathedral facade standing alone amid rubble, like a monument to something that no longer existed. People in Paris and London and New York stared at those images in quiet horror. They had heard of Pompeii. They had read about it in school, seen paintings of it in museums. Pompeii was ancient history, a tragedy from another age, another world. Saint-Pierre was last week. Saint-Pierre had trams and telegraph lines and opera seasons. It had newspapers and elections and ships crossing the Atlantic. It was part of the modern world. And the modern world had watched it disappear in 8 minutes. The psychological impact was profound. For the first time in the industrial age, humanity was confronted with the full, unmediated power of the natural world, not as something distant or historical, but as something immediate. Something that could reach into the present and erase it without warning. Back on the island, the work of recovery was slow and heartbreaking. Governor Moutet and his wife had not survived. They had stayed in Saint-Pierre as promised, and they had perished with the city they had sought to reassure. Whatever judgment history might place on their decisions in the days before the eruption, they had not fled when the moment came. They had remained. The political and human complexities of what had happened, the suppression of alarm, the prioritization of elections over evacuation, the reassurances given when warning was needed, would be debated in the French Parliament and in the press for years to come. But in the ruins of Saint-Pierre, debate felt distant. What was present was grief. An island in mourning. A Caribbean community shattered. Families across Martinique searching for names on lists of survivors that were heartbreakingly short. 30,000 names. And almost none of them answered. The mountain, for its part, was not finished. Mont Pelée would continue to erupt for more than a year after May 8th, a spine of solidified lava, an extraordinary geological feature called a volcanic spine or lava spine, slowly pushed upward from the summit in the months that followed, rising hundreds of meters into the air before eventually collapsing. Scientists watched it in astonishment. It was unlike anything they had documented before. The mountain was still speaking. The world, at last, was listening, but the city of Saint-Pierre would never hear another word. There is a particular kind of knowledge that only catastrophe can teach, not the knowledge found in textbooks or laboratories, not the kind assembled slowly, carefully in the quiet of academic debate, but the knowledge that arrives all at once, written in ash and silence, demanding to be understood because the alternative is to let it happen again. Saint-Pierre was that kind of lesson, and the world of science, to its credit, did not look away. In the months and years that followed the eruption of Mont Pelée, volcanologists, geologists, and natural scientists from across the world descended on Martinique. They came with instruments and notebooks, and the urgent conviction that what had happened here must not remain a mystery, that the deaths of 30,000 people must mean something beyond tragedy, that from the ruins of a city, a new understanding of the Earth's power might be built. They were right. And what they found changed the science of volcanology forever. First great revelation was the nuée ardente itself. The term had existed before. 1902, the French geologist Alfred Lacroix, who arrived in Martinique shortly after the eruption and spent months studying it in extraordinary detail, would later claim credit for formalizing it. But it was the eruption of Mont Pelée that gave the concept its full, terrible meaning. A pyroclastic density current, to use the modern scientific term, is not a single thing. It is a complex, layered phenomenon. At its leading edge moves a surge of superheated gas and fine ash, traveling at hurricane speed, carrying enough thermal energy to ignite wood, melt glass, and kill every living thing it touches within seconds. Behind the surge comes the main current, denser, heavier, carrying larger fragments of volcanic rock along with the ash and gas. Together, they are among the most lethal phenomena on Earth. What Lacroix and his colleagues documented at Saint-Pierre was the first systematic scientific record of this type of eruption. The patterns of destruction in the city revealed the current's direction, its speed, its behavior as it moved through streets and around obstacles. Buildings that faced the mountain had their walls pushed inward. Those facing away had walls pushed outward. The current had moved through Saint-Pierre like a wave through water, finding every opening, filling every space, leaving almost nothing untouched. The harbor told its own story. The ships had not simply sunk. They had been struck by the blast wave ahead of the main current, capsized or set afire, and then overwhelmed by the pyroclastic surge itself. The pattern of their destruction, the directions in which they had been pushed, the way the fires had burned loud. Scientists to reconstruct the event with remarkable precision. For an era before modern instrumentation, from this work came the formal classification of what is now called a Pelée eruption. Named permanently for the mountain that taught the world what it was. A Pelée eruption is characterized by highly viscous magma, thick, gas-rich, resistant to flow, that builds enormous pressure inside the volcanic conduit. When that pressure finally exceeds what the rock above it can contain, the eruption does not simply push upward. It may collapse sideways. It may blast outward through a weakness in the flank. And when it does, it generates pyroclastic density currents of extraordinary power and speed. This was the mechanism that had destroyed Saint-Pierre. And without the destruction of Saint-Pierre, science might not have understood it for decades more. There is a painful irony in that. The second great lesson was about volcanic gases. The survivors, the extraordinarily few who had lived through the event, described not only heat and darkness but a difficulty breathing, a burning sensation in the lungs. The pyroclastic current that swept through Saint-Pierre carried enormous concentrations of sulfur dioxide, carbon dioxide, and other volcanic gases, which displaced the oxygen in the air and poisoned those who inhaled them. Death in a pyroclastic current is mercifully fast, but understanding how volcanic gases behave, how they travel, how they concentrate, how they can be lethal even at distances where the heat might be survivable, became a critical area of study in the decades that followed. Today, gas monitoring is one of the most important tools in volcanic surveillance. The third lesson was about warning signs. In the weeks before May 8th, Mont Pelée had produced an extraordinary sequence of signals. Increased fumarolic activity, lahars, ground deformation, changes in river chemistry, animal behavior, audible explosions, ash fall. Every one of these phenomena taken together painted a clear picture of a volcano approaching a critical threshold. The science of the time could not fully read that picture, but the event at Saint-Pierre made it imperative to learn how. In the century that followed, the monitoring of volcanoes was transformed. Seismographs capable of detecting the finest tremors within volcanic systems, tiltmeters measuring the swelling of the ground as magma rises, gas sensors analyzing the chemical composition of emissions in real time, satellite imagery tracking thermal changes in ground deformation from space. None of these tools existed in 1902. All of them exist because of what happened in 1902, and yet technology alone has never been sufficient. The eruption of Mont Pelée was not simply a failure of science. It was a failure of communication, a failure of governance, a failure of the very human tendency to hear what we wish to hear and to suppress what is inconvenient. The scientific commission that had declared Saint-Pierre safe was not composed of fools. They were working with limited tools and genuine uncertainty. But the political pressure placed upon them, the need to project calm before an election, compromised the integrity of their assessment in ways that proved fatal. This, too, became a lesson about the relationship between science and power, about the danger of allowing political considerations to shape the communication of natural risk, about the responsibility of those in authority to place human lives above convenience, above economy, above the calendar. It is a lesson that has had to be relearned at terrible cost more than once since 1902. The ruins of Saint-Pierre did not speak in words, but for those willing to read them, in the angle of fallen walls, in the pattern of burned ships, In the testimony of the few who survived, they spoke with absolute clarity. The Earth had shown what it was capable of. Science had listened. And from that listening, a new discipline was born, one dedicated to the single, urgent purpose of ensuring that no city would ever again face what Saint-Pierre faced on the morning of May 8, 1902. Without warning. Without a chance, time passed. As it always does. The ash settled. The ruins cooled. The jungle, patient and relentless as it has always been in the tropics, began its slow return to the slopes of Mont Pelée. Vines crept across broken walls. Trees pushed through cracked stone. The green reclaimed what the gray had taken, and the mountain stood silent again. As it had been silent before, but the world that looked upon it now was not the same world that had looked upon it in 1901. The eruption of Mont Pelée had left a mark not only on the landscape of Martinique, but on the landscape of human understanding. A before and an after. A line drawn in ash across the history of how humanity relates to the living earth beneath its feet. Saint-Pierre was not abandoned entirely. In the years and decades that followed, a smaller, quieter town grew back along the same coastline. Not 30,000 people, nothing like that, but a community, rebuilt with the particular resilience that characterizes island peoples, who have always known that the sea and the land make their own rules and that life must be constructed around that knowledge. Not in defiance of it. The ruins of the old city were not cleared away. They were kept. Today, the remnants of Saint-Pierre still stand along the waterfront and in the streets behind it. The old theater, the base of the cathedral, the twisted iron of what were once elegant buildings. They have become, over the decades, something between a monument and a museum, a place where the past is not buried but preserved, where visitors can walk through the ghost of a city and feel, in the silence between the stones, the weight of what happened here. Beneath the harbor, the sunken ships of May 8th still rest on the ocean floor. They have become, with the passage of time, one of the most extraordinary diving sites in the Caribbean, encrusted with coral now, inhabited by fish. The Roraima and the others lie in the blue silence below the surface, slowly being reclaimed by the sea, transformed from wreckage into reef, from tragedy into ecosystem. Nature does not hold still, even in its memorials. Mont Pelée itself continued to remind the world of its nature. In 1929, the mountain erupted again, not with the catastrophic violence of 1902, but with sufficient force to cause alarm and to prompt the evacuation of the surrounding area. The new town of Saint-Pierre was partially damaged. The eruption served as a stark reminder, if one were needed, that the mountain had not retired, that it was resting, not finished. That distinction matters enormously. And it is precisely the understanding of that distinction between a dormant volcano and an extinct one, between a mountain that is sleeping and one that is gone, that drives the work of the scientists who watch Mont Pelée today. Because Mont Pelée is watched carefully, continuously, with instruments that the scientists of 1902 could not have imagined. The Observatoire volcanologique et seismologique de Martinique, the Volcanological and Seismological Observatory of Martinique, maintains a permanent network of monitoring equipment across the island and on the flanks of the mountain itself. Seismometers that detect the finest tremors within the volcanic system. GPS sensors that measure to the millimeter any swelling or deformation of the ground as magma moves beneath the surface. Gas analyzers that sample the emissions from the fumaroles continuously, tracking changes in the chemical composition of what the mountain exhales. Every breath the mountain takes is recorded. Every tremor, every shift, every change in the temperature or chemistry of its gases. The data flows in real time to scientists who have dedicated their careers to understanding this particular mountain, its history, its rhythms, its patterns of behavior. They know its past eruptions. They know the geological record laid down over thousands of years in the layers of rock and ash that form its body. They know, as well as science currently allows, what to watch for and what it means when they see it. In December 2020, that knowledge was put to a serious test. Mont Pelée began to show signs of reawakening. Seismic activity beneath the mountain increased significantly. Hundreds of small earthquakes were recorded in the weeks that followed. The kind of seismicity that scientists associate with the movement of fluids, possibly magma, within the volcanic system. The alert level for the volcano was raised. The people of Martinique watched the news with the particular attention of those who carry the history of 1902 in their collective memory. Evacuation plans were reviewed. Emergency protocols were activated. The observatory increased the frequency of its monitoring reports. Local authorities communicated with the public clearly and regularly, a direct, conscious response to the lessons of 1902. When communication had failed so catastrophically, the seismic crisis eventually stabilized. The mountain did not erupt, but the episode was a reminder, vivid and necessary, that the volcano beneath which modern Martinique lives its daily life is not a geological relic. It is an active system, a living part of the Earth's interior, connected to the same tectonic forces that built the island in the first place and that continue to shape it, slowly, invisibly. From below. The question volcanologists ask about Mont Pelée is not whether it will erupt again. It will. The question is when, and with what character, and whether the monitoring systems, the evacuation plans, the communication protocols, and the political will to act on scientific advice will be sufficient when the moment comes to ensure that what happened in 1902 remains a singular tragedy and not a repeating one. That is the work. Not glamorous work. Not the work of dramatic discoveries or headline moments. It is the patient, daily, unglamorous labor of watching and recording and analyzing and communicating, of building, year by year, a knowledge of the mountain that is deep enough and reliable enough to give the people who live in its shadow the time they need, the time that Saint-Pierre never had. There is something quietly profound about the scientists who climb the slopes of Mont Pelée today, who walk the same mountain that erased a city, who set their instruments in the soil above the same magma chamber that produced the nuée ardente of May 8, 1902. They are not fearless, they are careful. And in the science of volcanology, careful is everything. The mountain watches them as they watch it. And somewhere beneath the green slopes, beneath the jungle and the stone and the layers of ancient ash, the earth continues its slow, indifferent work. It does not hurry. It does not rest. It simply continues. As it has for millions of years. As it will for millions more. There is a question that lingers long after the science has been explained, long after the geology is understood, long after the pyroclastic currents have been named and classified and studied in universities around the world, long after the monitoring stations have been installed and the evacuation plans written and the alert levels defined. The question is not scientific. It is human. How do we live alongside something so much larger than ourselves? Martinique has been answering that question for over a century now. Not with a single decisive answer, life rarely offers those, but with the slow, daily practice of continuing, of building homes and raising children and planting gardens and opening shops and sailing out to sea, all within sight of a mountain that once erased everything. That takes a particular kind of courage, not the courage of a single dramatic moment, not the courage of the soldier or the hero, but the quieter, more enduring courage of those who choose to remain, who look at the mountain each morning and make their peace with it, who carry the memory of 1902 not as a wound that paralyzes, but as a knowledge that deepens their understanding of the ground beneath their feet. The people of Martinique have not forgotten. They could not. Even if they wished to, the ruins are still there. The sunken ships are still there. The name Saint-Pierre is still there, the smaller, quieter town that grew back along the same coastline, wearing the same name like a piece of clothing handed down through generations. Worn differently now, carrying different weight. Every year, on the 8th of May, the island remembers. It is not a celebration. It is not quite a mourning either, not after more than 100 years. It is something older and quieter than either of those things. A moment of stillness, a collective pause in the rhythm of daily life. a turning toward the mountain and the sea and the ruins, and an acknowledgement that what happened here was real, and that the people who were lost were real, and that the earth that took them is still here, still active, still part of every day that follows. Memory in places like this is not sentimental. It is practical. It is the thing that keeps the evacuation plans from gathering dust, the thing that keeps the observatory funded and staffed, the thing that ensures, when the seismometers begin to speak in the language of increased activity, that the people in authority remember what happened the last time the warnings were not heeded. Memory is infrastructure, and Martinique has built it carefully. But there is another dimension to what Saint-Pierre left behind. One that reaches beyond the island, beyond the Caribbean, beyond even the science of volcanology. It is a philosophical inheritance. The eruption of Mont Pelée forced the modern world to confront something it had been quietly avoiding in the age of industry and progress and technological confidence. The belief so seductive, so understandable, that human civilization had grown large enough and sophisticated enough to stand apart from the natural world, to manage it, to predict it, to be, in some fundamental sense, safe from it. Saint-Pierre answered that belief with 8 minutes of silence. We are not apart from the natural world. We are inside it. We are built on it, sustained by it, subject to it in ways that no amount of technology fully removes. The tectonic plates do not consult our calendars. The magma does not negotiate with our governments. The pyroclastic current does not pause for our elections. This is not a council of despair. It is an invitation to humility. The kind of humility that does not diminish human achievement but grounds it in reality. That acknowledges the extraordinary things our species has accomplished. The science, the art, the medicine, the music, the capacity to look at a ruined city and build from its ashes anew. Understanding of the earth while never losing sight of the context in which all of it occurs. We live on a living planet, one that was here long before us and will be here long after. One that operates on timescales so vast that a human lifetime is less than a breath. One that is, in the deepest sense, indifferent to our presence, not hostile, not malevolent, simply indifferent, following the laws of physics and chemistry and geology that have governed it since its formation. And yet, within that indifference we have found meaning. We have built cities and written symphonies and raised children and fallen in love and told stories around fires for 100,000 years. We have looked at volcanoes and felt not only terror but wonder. We have descended into the ruins of Saint-Pierre and felt not only grief but the fierce, stubborn insistence on understanding, on learning, on ensuring that the 30,000 voices silenced on a May morning in 1902 were not silenced entirely because their story is still being told. You are hearing it now. And that perhaps is the most human thing of all. The capacity to sit with tragedy, to hold it carefully, to refuse to let it become merely a number or a footnote or a cautionary tale stripped of its humanity. To insist that those 30,000 people were not simply victims of a geological event, but men and women and children who loved the island they lived on, who looked up at the mountain behind their city and saw, most days, nothing more threatening than a cloud. They deserved more time. They deserved a warning that was heard. We cannot give that back to them. But we can carry what they left us, the knowledge, the humility, the vigilance, and we can apply it every day, in every volcanic region on Earth where people live their lives in the shadow of the mountains that built their world. That is the legacy of Saint-Pierre. Not only in the history books, not only in the scientific literature, but in the quiet, continuous work of the men and women who watch the mountain today, who climb its slopes and read its signals and communicate what they find, so that someday, a city that might have been lost is instead evacuated in time. So that the warning is given, and this time, heard. Mont Pelée stands today as it stood on the morning of May 7th, 1902. Green, vast, draped in cloud. Patient in the way that only mountains can be. Patient. It is not finished. None of this is finished. The earth does not do endings. It does only CONTINUATIONS. And so must we.